As we move into the High Renaissance in Italy, we continue to see many of the same themes as we see in the early Renaissance period, but at this time artists are also gaining in status and gaining in prestige, and as a result, many of the artists of the High Renaissance are celebrities both in their own day as well as in our day. So one of those names that most people will recognize is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo's life starts out inauspiciously. He's an illegitimate son of his father, who was a relatively prestigious notaio in Florence, a position that's similar to a lawyer or a politician today. And because Leonardo's illegitimate, his father doesn't have the same responsibility to send him to school and to educate him the way his legitimate sons were educated. Instead, Leonardo was raised mostly at home by his grandparents and his uncles, and he was self-educated. He was allowed to concentrate on the things that he was interested in. This means he often focuses on intently on certain kinds of topics that catch his attention, and it also means that he is interested in a wide variety of topics. Today we use this term Renaissance man to mean somebody who's multi-talented, but it's really these artists like Leonardo that this term is coined for. One of Leonardo's most famous works of art today is The Last Supper. This image shows Christ and his disciples at their Last Supper together before Jesus is arrested. And we see that Jesus has just told his disciples that he knows he's going to be arrested. And we see them reacting in shock and dismay. Like Donatello's David earlier, we see that Leonardo is attempting to make each of these disciples a psychological portrait. So like Donatello, he's using humanism to help us understand what's happening in this image. Like Masaccio, Leonardo is also using linear perspective. So if we look at the room in which Christ and his disciples are seated, it's very unusual. We see these dark patches on the wall, and their main purpose is to show Leonardo's knowledge of linear perspective, and like Masaccio, he's using those to direct our eye to the figure of Jesus. Leonardo also brings in his knowledge of geometry. So we can see that the disciples are arranged in groups of 3, and each of those groups of 3 disciples makes a triangular shape. And Jesus himself makes a triangle in the center. His framing in the rear window sets him apart and isolates him from the other disciples, and he's calm where they are agitated. So overall, Leonardo shows us this continuation of the trends and ideas of the 15th century into the 16th century. Another artist that is very famous in the early 16th century is Michelangelo Buonarroti. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo gains a reputation for being a multi-talented individual, although where Leonardo's interests are famously in science and military maneuvers, in addition to art, Michelangelo is more focused on art. He is incredibly talented, though, creating pieces that are seen as masterpieces today in his early and mid-20s. Like Donatello previously, we see Michelangelo also borrowing from classical models. So this is another David. So again, we're referencing that story of David and Goliath, just like we see with Donatello. But where Donatello is fairly true to the biblical story, he shows us David as a young boy, as an adolescent. Michelangelo follows his classical models more closely, and David is older and more masculine looking. Like Donatello, we see that contrapposto pose in David's stance, and Michelangelo instead of doing a psychological portrait here, takes advantage of the fact that David and Goliath haven't fought yet. The battle is upcoming. And even though we know the outcome because we know the story, that tension of something about to happen catches and engages the reader's interest. Probably Michelangelo's most famous work, though, is the Sistine Chapel ceiling. This was a huge challenge for Michelangelo because he was not a fresco painter and he didn't know how to paint frescoes. So he had to hire assistants and hope they knew what they were doing. Ultimately, they didn't, and the panel on the lower left, the flood panel, which was the first panel Michelangelo attempted, had to be entirely chipped off and repainted, a process that took several months. But there's many other challenges to this as well. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is about 5,600 square feet of space, so it's an immense amount of space to cover and paint. It is slightly curved, as we can see in the upper picture, so that curvature has to be taken into account, otherwise the figures will be distorted. And it was 70 feet in the air. Michelangelo painted this not lying on his back, that's actually an urban legend, but standing up with one hand lifted over his head for hours on end every day, and he complained bitterly about the discomfort in doing so. However, in the end, he triumphed. This was completed, and even in the immediate aftermath of the painting, it was deeply beloved and regarded as a masterpiece. Probably the most famous excerpt, which we can see in the lower right corner here, is the creation of Adam that shows God, again, like the David, about to touch and transfer the spark of life into Adam's extended hand. And we really see Michelangelo's true love for the human body, the human form, and that study of anatomy that is also very much a part of the Renaissance.